sheep, ocelot, armor stand, parrot, armor stand, ocelot, parrot, ocelot, painting, armor stand, painting, 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 villager, sheep, villager, chicken, chickens, arachidus, sheep, armor stand, ocelot, chicken, parrot, sheep, armor stand, ocelot, sheep, parrot, sheep, ocelot, chicken, armor stand, painting, horse, painting, llama, painting, cow, sheep, chicken, skeleton, horse, painting, cow, painting, cow, box, holding, sheep, chicken, villager, egg, cow, sheep, jeb underscore, villager, sheep, cow, sheep, egg, sheep, cow, sheep, chicken, Bellis, sheep, cow, egg, sheep, llama, sheep. Dragon, villager, sheep, cow, sheep, chicken, sheep, horse, skeleton, sheep, cow, chicken, horse, llama, sheep, chicken, egg, chicken, Gordon Ramsay, sheep, villager, sheep, iron golem, sheep, Mr. Stubby, sheep.
I am doing this.
Painting. Found buried artifacts. Found buried artifacts. Creeping artifacts. Found. villagers, villagers, egg, cow, chicken, village. Yama, SRB,